Alright guys, today we'll be talking about one of the oldest kingdoms in the world, ta-seti, the land of the bow.
I've been looking this way ever since I remember, and it ain't gonna change, so I don't care what them people say. I will forever be this way. I will forever be this way.
And before we get started, let me remind the enemies that the information presented here today is regularly used by scholars in the field, no matter what their conceptual background. Before we get started, I don't think that we need a refresher course on what exactly a Nubian is, because the Eurocentric has been coming to us for years, defining who and what a Nubian is allegedly supposed to be. And so we have here on our screen some examples of that, and let's keep that in mind as we talk about Nubians today. The same Nubians that they said couldn't find Egypt, the same Nubians that they said were copying Egyptians and sitting around waiting to be a slave. Now that we've got that out the way, let's go ahead and talk about how they helped fashion pharaonic civilization. And so we've all heard the stories how the Nubians were nothing more than a slave, had nothing more than a tribal chief, and we all know that it's nothing more than propaganda. And for decades they've known about the kingdom of the bow. Their fantasy stories were thrown into disarray when direct evidence for kings in the Nile Valley before the reign of Narmer emerged in context in a place they never expected, which is Lower Nubia. This has been demonstrated and found physically on this earth, and we're going to be going a lot deeper into that right now. Not only this, they went head to head for supremacy in Waset, in Upper Egypt, by the standards of the Predynastic kings of Egypt. It says right here that if the presentation was not overwhelming in size and wealth by many times, and in diversity as well as amount, no argument for pharaonic status could be sustained. This also applies to the Predynastic Egyptian kings. Today we'll be talking about Bruce Williams, who responds to his final report on the very artifacts that reveal this astounding story to us. Right here where he writes that going into all this, he had the same assumptions that many other people had, but those assumptions were destroyed, one by one. Because the significance of almost every aspect of what he saw overwhelmed every last assumption that he had. He writes right here that given such a complete and sudden reversal of assumptions, there is reason to believe that knowledge of the achievements that created and sustained Egyptian civilization penetrated even further to the south than the Nubians at a very early time. And we can also see where he says that there must be a new search. And according to the sequence of tombs that was left there in Lower Nubia, he reveals to us that some 12 kings participated with other kings in Upper Egypt in the creation of a unified culture. They helped fashion pharaonic civilization, and thus a legacy for the first dynasty, which the world has marveled at for millennia. Now let's talk real quick about some things that a lot of us are very familiar with. Misinterpretations of publications, arbitrary dismissal of important lines of archaeological reasoning, arbitrary assertions, personal testimonials, and hearsay. Conclusions being announced without supporting evidence. And entire time periods being treated as a vacuum without any corroborating evidence, and despite overwhelming evidence to the contrary. Sound familiar, anyone? Of course, Bruce Williams wrote his findings with a full recognition of the fact that its views would be widely unpopular in the Eurocentric quarters. But at the end of the day, he wanted to provide scholars familiar with the period, which is the Predynastic, and its materials, an opportunity to make important connections. And these connections are exactly why the New York Times was the only publicly available publication that even acknowledged the existence of the kingdom of ta-seti. Had a critic by the name of W.Y. Adams, and let's just say Mr. Adams didn't put in very much effort into his objections. I mean, after all, he was laying his eyes on unmistakable pharaonic images that were born in the pre-dynastic of a legendary age. And so, the first thing Adams does is immediately start lying and claiming that Mr. Williams wrote that the Nubians were the origin for the pharaonic monarchy. But no such claim was made in that article or in any other article which had the advance approval of Mr. Williams.
Black spark, white fire. Dion Chrysonomos points out in 30 AD also point out the Egyptian priests mocked
More
the Greeks
specifically, the words participation and helped fashion pharaonic civilization were used. More specifically, he writes here that the unification of Nubia came before that of Upper Egypt, because this royal cemetery that we'll be talking about can be shown to precede the known monuments of the Egyptians at Abydos. Specific pharaonic motifs occur well before the monumental developments of the early Egyptians, and we're talking about going back clear to Nagata II. And we're talking about going back to the times of the original followers of Horus. Getting back to the Eurocentric critic, one of his objections that we've heard a million times already was that even if this was all royal and pharaonic representations, that they actually really didn't come before Egypt's unified monarchy, that they actually were around the same time or even later. To achieve this, connections between the incense burner and the art from before this Egyptian period are dismissed without explanation. Sound familiar? Adams tries to build inconsistencies where there are none, even after there was already a detailed examination of the evidence. And then finally, Adams disregards the chronological relationship between the Nubians and the Egyptians at this time entirely, which is a clear-cut example of irresponsibilities in the world of humanities. The fact of the matter is, Cemetery L and the Nubians A group can be established with considerable confidence through a series of reciprocal interconnections. through a series of reciprocal interconnections. None of these interconnections has anything to do with anything Arabic, European, or anything else that suits your fancy. As a matter of fact, correlations between various phases and historical persons can be made with much greater clarity and reliability than might be expected. And it's important for us to remember that, because a lot of times people try to throw up fog and all types of screens to obscure the vision. Now, these pre-dynastic Nubian kings that strove with the Egyptians in the earliest times, what they left us was an essential foundation for their candidacy as royalty. And this has been easily pointed out by the uniquely disproportionate size and wealth of the tombs that's been found in the kingdom of Ta-seti, in the land of the bow. And the fact that these tombs were so high quality, so rich, and the same size as Egyptian tombs even, the European critic decides that they're just going to dismiss the foundation as irrelevant without further explanation.
Now, you can look at me and say, well, you're not black. Right, I'm not black, but I'm not white. I have been mixed. I am a descendant of mixed Egyptians.
But don't worry, Bruce can handle himself. These Nubian tombs we're talking about are once again held up to the same standard as the pre-dynastic Egyptian king. And so he has a sequence of tombs with the Nubians. He counts about 12 kings that participated with the Egyptian kings in the creation of this pharaonic culture. Not only that, published information from the cemetery can be measured against this sequence.
They gonna bomb Ethiopia? I said, oh yeah!
Now, George Reisner was one of the guys who discovered that there were pre-dynastic Ethiopians, and you guys already know what his response was, to call them magic Caucasians. And when he couldn't do that, he just decided to go for the downgrade. And as an ancient kingdom, the land of the bow had connections going up into Egypt and Asia. They had plenty of exports and imports found with them. We can see where Mr. Williams writes here that the numerous Egyptian exports to the Nubians date essentially to the pre-dynastic period. But check out what Mr. Reisner does here. Despite that evidence, and explicitly without evidence, he just decides that he's going to move the Nubians to some type of place after the fact. At least 3 of his colleagues pointed out the error of his ways, and it looks like at least one of them tried to go and correct him on it. So what we see here is fathers of Egyptology being highly irresponsible as usual. All of the links to early Egypt are to be abandoned, or they're attributed to the export of goods that the Egyptians essentially considered as junk. And I like what Bruce writes here. Chronological methods of this sort that arbitrarily dismiss important bodies of evidence belong to an age when broad assumptions of cultural retardation went unchallenged. And what he means there in layman's terms is magic Caucasian stories. And Reisner's use of such assumptions when dealing with Nubian artifacts needlessly distorted the archaeological and historical record in Nubia for many years, despite Petrie's objections.
Or you are just simply European that has moved into Egypt and stayed there and had kids there and kept being white.
A real African face. It's a real African face.
Also a very African-looking face.
And again, yes, George Reisner is largely responsible for the punishment of the Nubians, but there was a whole lot of other people involved with that. And it's yet another reason that reveals to us that they gave up any claims to high culture long ago. Getting back to the European critic, we see here that Adams, he criticizes Williams. One of his main criticisms of Williams was the existence of the incense burner itself, which he was barely able to attack. As far as this incense burner, originally, before they even left the site, they tried to say it was limestone. They tried to say that it was actually made by an Egyptian and given to a Nubian, but they figured out years ago that this was an original Nubian item. Now that we know that, we can move on. All of this goes hand in hand with plenty of research that has been done by some heavy-hitting academics in the 21st century. Going clear down to the central Sudan, up to the Nile Delta, what we find is a so-called Nubian field day. And you know what? There's actually a whole lot more documentation about the Qustul incense burner than a lot of Egyptian stuff that they show us today. Not only that, Bruce can confirm that the records have not been altered. Unfortunately for the Eurocritic, the records can be checked. One of the most important things about the Qustul incense burner is that there's more information on the incense burner than what can be found on the scorpion mace head, which itself is a Predynastic Egyptian artifact. And so far as we can see, there's absolutely nothing in here about Germanic lands. There's no stories in here about magic Caucasian lands. There's no Arabic insight anywhere. And none of these findings are found anywhere in London, Paris, Brussels, or anywhere else. And then what Adam says here is hilarious. Because no royal remains have been recognized with the Nubians before, that means that none exists. Never mind the fact that there's all kinds of Egyptian kings from that time whose bodies they never found. They never found King Scorpion. They never found Narmer. They never even found the first Egyptian king. He then goes full clown mode when he says, hardly a grave. He says that they pretty much checked all the graves of the Lower Nubian. It would appear at that point that he just gave up and was just simply putting his hand up to say no. And here Bruce lets us know that with the Nubians was found not just a palace facade of nested rectangles surmounted by oris, but there are also other palace facades. One of them found on the Qustul incense burner. And these palace facades that we're talking about, these specific types of palace facades are known so far only in Nubia. And so to make a long story short, it's clear that the Qustul incense burner and everything involved around it belongs to the Nubians. And there's been other royal representations that have long been known in Nubia that show the same subject in the exact same styles. The birth of ancient Egyptian civilization as we know it. And this is the state of Lower Nubia as we are approaching Dynasty 0. It makes the European critic sick. And so he puts up one last objection where he tries to include his personal private friends. And then he called up his homies at the American Anthropological Association for some reason, who said that the theoretical conclusions should not be published apart from or in advance of the evidence from which they were derived. Which is exactly what happened. Because right here in Nubia, we find the white crown. We find the Oris falcon. We find the rosette. We find a specific palace facade only known in Nubia. Not to mention the sacred boat and all the rest of the stuff that they found. And the fact that Horus is even there emphasizes the development of the official religion of the Nubians, which was of the same type later characteristic of dynastic Egypt, that it was all one Nile Valley culture with regional variation. Now, when we go and take a wider look at this period in world history, let's go on over to Europe, and we see that there's absolutely nothing going on that has anything to do with anything Egyptian here. There's no reason to look for the asbestos and organic temper wearers people. And the typical comb wearer people, I don't think that we even need to look that up anymore. The ancestors of the Germanic worshippers of the planet and the ancestors of the so-called Arabic person were all hanging out in their original ancient homelands. And to go one deeper, the Proto-Indo-European language had not even splintered off into the daddy language groups that we know today. And so this is what we mean when we say that the so-called Indo-European didn't even exist. Because for one, they were still learning how to talk and trying to figure out where Europe was at. Trying to figure out how to get to ancient Greece or whatever magic land they were looking for.
Will make our civilization.
Getting back to Africa, even though the A group culture was substantially derived from that of Upper Egypt, in the early Predynastic period, native objects are not Egyptian, and many reveal characteristic traits from the Sudan. And this is that point in history where we start to see the development of an actual Egyptian, where we start to see a separation of what was once a shared pool of cultures that has been demonstrated time and again. Over and over again. This has nothing to do with any of the monkeys that come here and has anything to say about anything. We could see the palace facade for ourselves. We could see the Horus Falcon. We see the salute coming from the land of the bow, ta-seti, the first nome of Egypt. Here we can see this man saluting a serac or a palace facade with the Horus Falcon above it, labeled by a bow over a rectangle as the Horus of ta-seti. This indicates that Nubia was a territorial state. Contrast this to the nonsense propaganda that they give us today that says that the Nubians were barbarians. Long before you even knew where Greece was at, the Nubians were fully civilized.
But I gotta go research.
Long before they even knew where Greece was at, the Nubians had already long established a Nile Valley culture. Before the Indo-European even figured out how to talk in any sort of way, the Nubians were already legends on the earth. And so the original barbarian on this planet has the nerve to call the Nubians barbarians at the gates. And so these were the developments going on deep in the south. We can see right here for ourselves that the vulture is obliterating an enemy, and as Bruce Williams tells us right here, it's labeled Upper Egypt. And this scene, together with a label on another jar that they found, shows a culture attacking Hierakonpolis. There's a faded ink label on one of the storage jars that they found that describes the conflict with Hierakonpolis in Egypt. Here we got a necklace, looks like any necklace that you can find in Africa today. We can see the quality for ourselves. Had this necklace been found anywhere in Central Europe, it would be displayed prominently and go on tour all across Europe and America. The fact of the matter is, this jewelry belonged to one of the first pharaonic kings in world history. and as we can see for ourselves, it's high quality. Pottery imported from around the world, and it shows how strong the interconnections were for the ancient Nubians. Of course, this is the land of the bow, so we got to make sure that we have an arrowhead to let that ass know. We have thoroughly scrutinized pharaonic regalia and images found with the ancient Nubians. And these same Nubians are the link to the rise of the first dynasty as we see it on the Narmer palette. Hierakonpolis itself in research has been called a Nilotic city. As a matter of fact, Nubian burials have been found in Hierakonpolis throughout all of dynastic Egyptian history. In fact, Bruce even lets us know right here that A-group tombs, including one of royal size and design, have been found at Hierakonpolis itself. And so that's a huge clue that the kings of the land of the bow were going up against other Nubian kings there at Hierakonpolis. As for the kingdom of ta-seti, as we all know, eventually they were diminished by the first king of Egypt. And we see this reflected in the material record when we see that these royal tombs are now reduced in stature. By the next generation, finally, appears to be contemporary with the first great royal burials at Abydos and the last Egyptian pharaohs before the first dynasty. The demise of ta-seti coincides with the demise of Qustul and coincides with the campaign of Aha in Nubia, the first king of the Egyptian first dynasty. And did I mention he recorded the smiting of ta-seti himself? And it was after this that the A-group culture ceased to exist in Lower Nubia. And while they ceased to exist in Lower Nubia, actual Nubians continue to live in Egypt, even in the Old Kingdom. Which is exactly what happened. So we can see for ourselves now why no other publication available to the public even wants to talk about this, because it throws their fantasy stories directly in the trash. And we can also see why they skip straight to Narmer, because our story usually starts with Near Eastern farmers and then we're talking about Narmer, right? What the critics can't learn to all of this is that this belief that Egypt was somehow isolated in Africa in early times is nothing more than a fantasy story. It is not based on any type of reality. The Neolithic of the Sudan is much more complex socially than they previously thought, even a generation ago. They have said over and over again in the research that it has significant influence in the earliest phase of Neolithic culture in Upper Egypt, but they just choose not to engage with that fact at all. And they've also been writing for years that the pharaonic dynasty of rulers that arose with the Nubians played a role in the emergence of a united Egypt. As for the rest of the Nubians living in that area, the actual desert retreated about 800 kilometers to the north, and this made wide areas available for people to just walk straight through. Discoveries in the North Sudan include evidence of relations with Upper Egypt's earliest cultures. And we can see for ourselves right here that the A group belongs once again to the Neolithic of Sudanese tradition, but also Egyptian culture. So when they come with the punishment of the Nubians, that's something that they try to deny with no evidence, and then they just choose not to engage with that, even though it's a fact. When we say fact, many times there is no difference. And so at this time, leading up to the Predynastic, these so-called Nubian cultures, they spread across the savannah, probably as far as the Gulf Kabir, which is pretty damn far. That's almost to Chad. That's almost to Chad and the Kingdom of Yam. And at the end of the day, neither Nubia nor the deserts were mere fields of activity for the Egyptians. And even more damaging, these deserts were highways to regions farther away. And so at the end of the day, we have these incredible findings. We have these pre-dynastic regalia wearing not only the white crown, but Horus is also found with them. The palace facade, the sacred boats, all of it. And instead we get the Near Eastern farmer story, we skip straight to Narmer, and then we get magic Caucasians. And as we all know, it's highly irresponsible, and they give up any and all claims to high culture. So what we just went over today was in fact the birth of a legend, a birth of the Ethiopians as the baby steps of Western civilization as we know it. Thank you very much for watching, and I will see you guys next time.
Set me up, almost blast. 15 up in that pocket rocket. Bitch think fast, I can't go.
Smash.